Good afternoon. So, good afternoon. It's really nice to be here, and I want to basically give a talk that is the follow-up to Mike's talk that was given previously. So, in case you didn't see the previous talk, he was talking about the extensible web and how it's important for web developers, people of the web, to get involved in the production of web technology and not just wait upon the standards organizations and browsers to produce the technology for us as web developers. And I'm going to go into details about how to push that further. And that is why the idea is that the upcoming HTML platform is actually from you and not from us people in W3C. So just a very quick word of introduction. I'm initially a web developer. I went into standards completely by mistake. I've been doing standards for the past 12 years or so, and I keep trying to get back to doing development work because it's actually what I like doing. But then when I do development work, I realize that standards suck, so I have to go back to standards to try to fix the development. And I would really like that whole process to get a lot better. I worked on W3C HTML that was released as HTML5 at the end of last year, and a bunch of other standards like SVG and some DOM and CSS stuff. But most of the time I like open source and I like being lazy. I don't want to have to work too much to get things to work. And these things like open source and laziness are really powerful motivators for the rest of the things that are coming up next. And I hope you like open source and you like laziness as well. I think they're very important values in life. So standards, right? When you know, a lot of web developers have tried to read a standard, maybe like a good one, like the XML schema part 2, or you know our ontology, a web ontology language, and things like that. Or maybe some developers have tried to join the mailing list and see how things work. And so most of the time the reaction from developers is this: no! But in fairness, it's not always like that. Sometimes developers just go, why? Why? But I mean, yes, there are problems in standards, but before we go into those problems, maybe it's good to remember why standards are important. I mean, we take this for granted, but we never actually ask the question, why do we do standards? It's, you know, it's like, oh yeah, standards are good, but I'll go and hack on my thing. Do you recognize what this is?
Canvas.
No. I'm not asking technically. Technically, this is a div, but that's not very important. Does anyone have an idea what this is? This is a sheet of paper. This is actually an A4 sheet of paper, and it corresponds to a standard known as ISO 216 that defines the various shapes of paper that are the most widely adopted standard in the world. They're not used everywhere, but it's the most adopted standard. And it actually matters. If you have a pen, it will interoperate with pretty much any kind of paper most of the time. At least the size won't be the issue. But if you have a printer, if you have binders, if you have all sorts of things that actually go around paper, it helps to have a standard, because otherwise if you buy one brand of paper, you have to have the binder that goes with it, and maybe the staples even that go with it, and all sorts of other tools that go around it. So standards matter even for the most stupid things, the most obvious daily things like paper. And in fact, there was a very good image that I could never find again, because I think they only printed it and never published it on the web, sadly, from the Swedish Standards Organization, where you see a room, oh no, it's outside a house with a family, and it's just a normal house and a normal family, and they're just doing normal weekend things. And there's an overlay you can put on top of it, and it has a red dot on everything that has a standard for it. And basically the entire thing goes red, because there are standards for like glass quality, for electricity, for any kind of object that might break, for toys, for all sorts of things. So standards are absolutely everywhere. But honestly, standards suck. Anyone who's tried to get involved in standards work, not just web standards, internet standards in general, technical standards in general. We were just here before the session talking about going to 3GPP and how much we hated it. So it tends to be a general problem. I'm going to focus on web standards, but in general, they're not great, and they're especially not great for developers who like openness and who like things to be easy and simple and straightforward and technical. So for instance, one reason standards suck is here. The W3C does great stuff. It does almost everything in public. So everything it does has a public mailing list. So now you have an idea and you want to take it to the W3C and you know, hey, it's great, those people do everything in public. It's wonderful. I'm just going to find, I just have to find what mailing list I'm going to post that, you know, that idea or that question to. Well, the number up there is the number of public mailing lists that the W3C currently runs or archives. That's quite a few, and it's listed on a huge page. You can find it, but you're never going to find from that page where you're supposed to bring your idea. You might try looking for documents that are close to your idea and figure out which group runs which mailing list, which corresponds to that document, but it's a hard process. So the first barrier to entry is just finding where to go, and most people give up right there. It's like I've known people who are extremely smart, extremely competent. They can find information anywhere on the web about technical stuff, but they have an idea they want to bring to W3C. The only thing they can find out how to do is to tweet at the W3C Twitter account, because they gave up on everything else. It's a good thing we actually watch because we have an IRC channel with the people tweeting to W3C, but you know, 140 characters isn't a great way of conveying a technical idea. You might need a little bit more subtlety, and so this is one of the problems that we're trying to address. Another problem is that, let's assume you've somehow found the mailing list, like public HTML or public web apps, or one of those big mailing lists, you know, like www style, where you have 800 messages per month. When you join, it sort of feels a bit like this. It's everything. So you join a mailing list and you're immediately in the middle of a conversation between people you mostly don't know, talking about things a lot of the time you know nothing about, because groups tend to work on a lot of different things, and even if you're an expert in one of those things and have an idea on this, you probably know nothing. The chances you know nothing, or at least don't have expertise on all of the other things that the groups are working on. Also, people are not always very nice, and I know a lot of people have told me, I started joining that mailing list. I didn't want to write immediately because I wanted to read it for a few weeks before I felt comfortable with the people and the style and how to talk. But then I noticed that people were often very rude and very mean to one another. It's not the case in every group. Some groups are actually very nice and very friendly and very welcoming. But it can, you know, if you see someone being mean to someone else on the mailing list that you just joined, you sort of get the impression that if you try to say something and it turns out to be stupid and you don't know why it was stupid, you're just going to be punched in the face. So that's also something that we need to fix. We need to make sure that mailing lists and the way we communicate in general is always welcoming, so that no one feels scared. I was reading an article just earlier today about how the Linux community, for instance, can be very aggressive. And this guy was saying, well, if your filter for contributors is anyone who has a tolerance for being abused by other people, especially if it's abused by other famous people like Linus Torvalds, that's a very stupid filter. You want the ideas from the people who don't like to be insulted or who don't want to be afraid of being insulted. And so that is also one of the problems we're looking at. A third problem is the process. Now, I mean, W3C has made a lot of progress in making its process lighter, but it still does get in the way and it still annoys people who just want to bring an idea, who just want to make things a little bit better. Basically, if you start, I don't know if this game exists in Japan. It doesn't exist in France, but I think it's an English game. Basically, you roll the dice and you go from step to step. And if you stop on the ladder, you can go up. So if you stop here, you skip all the way here. But if you stop on a snake, you slide down. And basically, trying to get a document from an idea all the way to the perfect web up here, it feels a lot like this. You have an idea, it's great. You start a working group, it's great. You talk and you talk and you talk with people, great. You start having and you go and you start publishing your idea, wonderful. You'd think it might stop here, right? But there's quite a way to go all the way there. And then you have to enter the painful parts of process where you get feedback and people use the process against you because they don't like you. Then browser vendors completely ignore your idea. And so you have no implementation, so you have to go back here. And most people give up before they reach here. It usually is like the third generation of people working on a given technology who even get here. And this can be extremely frustrating. The t-shirt I'm wearing today is from the Responsive Images community group. And those were the people who decided that responsive images were important to developers, because anyone who's trying to do content for desktop and mobile, or for desktop that may have retina displays and all sorts of resolutions, knew that responsive images were important. But browser vendors were like, just use JavaScript, I don't know. And a lot of standards people were just like, yeah, I don't know, it looks fine on my screen. And so these people basically got together as a community, and they had to fight and fight for what, 2 or 3 years before finally being successful in delivering what was an obvious idea that every single web developer who'd produced content for 2 platforms knew was right. But the gatekeepers in the standards and the browser vendors communities just had stopped them and essentially blocked them from making progress. And they managed to fight their way into a standard. The thing is, the fact that they succeeded should not be taken as proof that the system works. They succeeded because they were extremely badass, and they fought and fought and fought. But it should have been a lot simpler. They should have been able to come and say, hey, we have this idea for responsive images. It has technical issues. Let's work on the technical issues, and 6 months from now, we'll start having something. Of course, the idea of the extensible web manifesto and report card that Mike was talking about earlier are going to help with that, but they're not enough. In the case of picture, it's not something that you can do in JavaScript, because you need to go so deep into the browser, and it needs to be so efficient if it's going to work, that this has to be a standard. So basically the idea going forward is that for anything that developers can prototype and do themselves, we want to expose primitives so that developers can actually do that, but there will still be a need for standards for some of the things that you cannot possibly do yourself. So for instance, APIs to devices like to USB or serial, there's no way we can expose primitives that will allow someone to build that on top of the browser. We have to do it, we have to expose it as a standard. So the idea is really to make it possible, to make it easier for the cases in which you need a standard to do so. So all of those problems put together basically lead not just to an ivory tower, but an ivory tower on a small rock floating in space somewhere really, really far away. And this is actually the end of the world in Never-Ending Story. But it's not that people who do standards or who work on browsers want to be locked up in an ivory tower. It's just an accumulation of small mistakes we make, having too much process, being too aggressive in communication, not being clear enough as to how people can bring their ideas in, that basically build a wall around us and that build an ivory tower that shouldn't be there. And a typical result from that is app cache. This is a graph that lays out not the way app cache works, because the way app cache works is actually much more complicated than this. This is the model that you need to have in your mind as a developer if you want to use app cache in a way that won't shoot you in the face. And this diagram from Jake Archibald actually came out of a meeting we had that involved like top-notch developers and browser vendors, people who really know their stuff. And we realized after 2 hours of discussion that no one had a complete mental model of this one feature of the platform loaded in their heads. And we tried to figure out exactly what developers needed to know in order to use app cache that was supposed to be an easy feature. And instead it was a complete failure. So this is what happens when developers are not sufficiently involved. We get terrible output that is way too complicated to use. Now, of course, even if we fix all the issues that I just listed, standards remain difficult. It's not, it remains technical. There are lots of issues to do with backwards compatibility. So a lot of the time, someone might think, hey, I have this great idea, but it turns out it's difficult to make it work because the content that was authored 20 years ago still cannot be broken today. The security model of the web platform also has its complexities. Sometimes you might think, hey, this could actually work, and then someone looks at it and goes, but hang on, if you use your feature in this way or that way, then you can actually steal data from the user or break their computer somehow or steal their session, anything like that. So it is difficult, but we can make it easier. And we've started trying to make it easier. We've taken a few first steps over the past few years in trying to improve the way in which developers can contribute to the platform. These are just the first steps, and afterwards I'll move on to the next steps that I think are the exciting things. The first step we took was actually to test the web forward thing. As you know, you may have noticed that sometimes browsers don't work exactly the same way. Sometimes, and so the idea is that in order to ensure that browsers all implement standards in the same way, you need tests. It's just like for any kind of software project, if you want to make sure it works, you need a test for the feature. And if the idea is that if two browsers pass the test in the same way, then they work in the same way, so that you can have tests that really say what the standard means. We have been, over the past 20 years of W3C, extremely bad at testing. The classic example is, I'm not even sure if CSS 2.1 had tests when it shipped, or maybe certainly not many. I think SVG 1.1 shipped with maybe 120 tests for a specification that's 700 pages long or something like that. I mean, you probably can't even test like rectangle properly with 120 tests, let alone the entire thing with like clipping and masks and animation and so on. So with our friends from Adobe, Test the Web Forward, which is another of those beautiful URLs with endless words put together, and the Web Platform Tests, which is a collaboration between W3C and What Working Group, were started. And the idea here is that people can organize events where they write tests, or they can just contribute tests directly about the specs that they're interested in. And it's still not as easy as we would like to make it, but it's a lot better than it used to be. And the idea is that if, as a developer, you notice that browsers are very different and they're not operating in the same way for a feature you care about, then you can write a test for that feature. And by writing a test for that feature that goes into that repository, it means that browser vendors will eventually notice that their browser is failing that test, and then they can start fixing it. We're not yet at the point where browser vendors run those tests automatically, all of them, but at least Mozilla does it already, and the others, several of the others, are working on just basically running these tests as part of their continuous integration process. So the idea is, if you make a pull request with a test that surfaces a bug in a browser, it gets reviewed and accepted, and in the next continuous integration run, the next time the browsers start building this, they will see it as a bug on their side. So this is a much more powerful way of providing feedback about broken things in browsers than going to their bug interfaces and things like that, because this is reusable by everyone. The other thing, second step that's important is the extensible web, and I won't go into great details because the great Mike Smith did it right before me. But basically, the idea here is, as I was saying earlier, to provide developers with the fundamental primitives that are needed in order to build their own features. So an example is web components that allows people to build their own new elements. And the idea is that eventually people will be able to build elements that behave like any native element of the HTML platform. But it's not just elements, it's also JavaScript primitives, so that instead of providing high-level, complicated features that don't work, we provide low-level features that might be a little bit difficult to use at first, but that can be used to build powerful things on top of that you don't have to request from standards and you don't have to request from browser vendors. I think a good example here is the IndexedDB API. Everyone hates it because if you use it directly, it's very low level. You're basically addressing an index storage file. This is very much like the C APIs from the 70s or something like that. But on top of that kind of API, you can build MongoDB, you can build MySQL, it's a very powerful storage system, and you can use that to develop the kind of storage you like on top of it that you can then reuse everywhere without having to ask browser vendors to do it for you. And the third and final step that I think is particularly important in fixing standards is that at some point we actually wrote down the things that matter most in the order in which they matter. So users are more important than developers, or well, in this room we can say mostly developers matter, right? But in general we say that users are more important than developers. Developers are more important than browser vendors. Browser vendors are more important than the stupid people who write specs like me, and the stupid people who write specs are more important than theoretical purity. Basically, no one cares about theoretical purity. You can be right, so if it doesn't work for the rest, then it really doesn't matter. And this is actually important because this solves debates over design. This is what are the priorities in design. If it's hard for developers to use, but it really helps users, then that's going to be the most important thing. But if it's easy to write a specification for it, but it really screws over developers, then that's the wrong thing to do. You need to help the developers before you help the browser vendors, before you help the people writing specifications. And this might seem trivial, but it's important because you can use this in an argument with someone. You can say, okay, you're making life easier for browser vendors, but you're making it terrible for developers, so you're doing it wrong. You're getting your priorities wrong. You should do it in this different way. That's for the stuff we have. The stuff that I'm really interested and excited about is the future, and the future is now. And this is all about you folks, not just in this room, of course, but everywhere. We've started putting together a number of new things that are being built and improved progressively to make it possible for developers to become a part of the standards platform. As I said, the people who did the responsive images thing, they ran into a lot of trouble to get there, but it also gave us a lot of information about what needed to be fixed and what needed to be improved. So the first part of the solution is something called Discourse on specifiction.org, and basically this tries to address the issue of finding where to provide your ideas, where to discuss the issues. There's just one place to go to. You can go to this site and create an account. It's all really easy. and you can start discussing things, and it's all topic-based instead of being main list-based. And it's likely that some of you have used web forums before, and you still want to scratch your eyes out from having done so. The good news is the people who did Discourse, which is the name of the software running this, they actually did a great job reinventing web forums. So this is actually nice. It's easy to use. It's very fluid. It's very simple and very pleasant to use. And also, you will note if you look at if you go into the conversations that are taking place there, that people there are actually being nice. I'm one of the admins and moderators of this platform. We almost have 600 users now, and it's a fairly recent thing. And there's only one time that I had to close a thread down because people were starting to be mean, and they were not really, really mean. They were just being a little bit, a little, sort of like little dicks or something. But in general, it's very friendly. You can easily read it if you have. The idea is this is not a support group for development, so it doesn't mean to replace Stack Overflow. If you have a question about why your CSS doesn't work or something like that, you could keep going to the things that you're already using. But if you have an idea for something that should be a standard, then by all means, go here. And if you look that someone wanted the ability to have error messages in a language other than English, for instance, or improve the media control API so that you could control video and audio better. Some people have problems with the on-screen keyboard that pops up on top of the content, and they don't know where it is, so they can't put suggestions in the right place. I think that the IME API is going to enhance that. So basically, the idea is that you don't have to know a lot about standards. All you have to do is be nice and describe the problem, describe the solution you would like to have, and you can have a conversation here. And as you can see, most of the conversations are not extremely long. This is not like triple dub style where you will start a thread and you will get 500 responses and you have no idea what most of them mean. The idea here is to be very focused. People see with what other people have written already, they'll just reply to what they need to reply. So so far it's working pretty good. But of course, there's a limit to discussion. At some point, you reach the end of a thread, you have agreement with a bunch of other nice people about what standard you would like to see, what feature you would like to see, but you can't do that in the forum, right? You can't just start specifying things in the forum, because that would be a terrible mess if people had to just go through the forum to find the specs. So the next step that goes with it is called the Web Specs project. This is a screenshot from the front page. It's on specs.webplatform.org. And the idea is to make it as easy to produce open standards as it is to produce open source. So a few quick details about this. The idea is that you use GitHub to write specifications. So if there's an existing specification in the system and you want to change it, you just fork it and make a pull request. Or if you make a big change to it and you're not sure that the pull request will be accepted, you can fork it, make the big change, and then propose it to be published. And the publishing system is automatic, so you'll very quickly be published on the official Specs web platform site. And that means you can then ask people to review it, to check the differences between your proposal and the proposal that you're modifying. And it allows you eventually, through the discussion, to merge proposals together in order to get a common specification. Also, same thing, if no one is working on the feature you would like, you can start it yourself. Is just getting published as part of the system only requires one pull request and your own repository, so it's very simple and straightforward. There's still bugs in the software that run this, but it's been running for about a month, and it's okay. And besides, if there are bugs, you can scream at me and I'll fix them. Yeah, the idea really is to take what works for open source, what works really well for open source, and bring them to standards. And what gets published on specs.webplatform.org are not meant to be final standards. It's just a way for the community to contribute and to build its ideas and put them together. And then once an idea is sufficiently well put together, then a standards organization can take it and start working with the community in order to push it further. And the idea is this is agnostic in terms of standards organizations. You could take it to W3C, you could take it to the WOT working group, you could take it to the IETF. It doesn't matter to us. The idea is really to encourage people to do standards, and then the place that makes most sense to take it to the next step, to make it a proper rubber stamp standard, it will surface by itself. And in fact, TC39, the people who are doing JavaScript, are already using, not this part of the platform, but they're already using Discourse for a lot of their discussions. So it's encouraging to see standards organizations working together instead of against one another. The basic principles behind web specs are essentially that things should be hackable. If you're a hacker, if you know how to do open source, like grab, fork a repo, make the change you want, and make a pull request, then it should be easy to do the same thing on a specification. Things should be forkable. It might seem strange today, but there are some standards organizations that publish their standards using licenses that don't allow you to make modifications. This is obviously an idea from the 20th, possibly even the 19th century. So this is something that we change, and we only use licenses that allow forking. It's important to be thoughtful. The idea of being thoughtful is that you're nice to other people and try to think of what their problems are, and if they're wrong, why they're wrong, instead of just insulting them. Of course, it should all lead into royalty-free standards, so the idea is to make it very easy to take something from web specs into W3C space so that it can become a proper royalty-free standard eventually. This means that we have a few small things to check before you start, but basically it's all automated. We apply software practices to the development of standards. Again, it might seem strange, but today a lot of standards are done in a manner that would seem completely crazy to anyone who's written software. A good example of this is the HTML specification itself, which is 120,000 lines in a single file, and has basically no way of extracting content or putting things into manageable parts, etc. So the idea here is that to really push towards sane practices in software, and a big part of that is actually testing. We don't require tests to be written immediately when someone submits a standard, because that's asking too much at the beginning of a conversation. But in order for a specification to move to the master branch, then it needs to have tests that are passing, which seems normal. So you're welcome to get started. This is the link to the docs. The docs are not perfect yet, but we're getting there. And there's also an IRC channel with currently a few, maybe a dozen people hanging out there. They're all friendly, except for me, if I'm in a bad mood. But usually I try to be nice. But yeah, it's a nice environment, and you're very welcome to contribute. And even if you don't have an idea for a spec, but you think it would be nice, you like the general project, you can actually go here and help work on the source code that actually powers the automatic publishing system and the updates and all that. There's a little bit of Python, I'm sorry about that, but most of it is proper JavaScript for real web developers. Sorry. But it's meant to be again something that's easy to contribute to. Most of the code there, if your pull request is accepted, is immediately deployed on the site. So there's very little overhead, and it ships pretty quickly. So yeah, the idea is that everyone should experiment with absolutely crazy things, either with the primitives or with creating new standards and new technology and shims that go with them. And one of the starting points, a good example of someone who experiments a lot, is Steve Faulkner. And so if you want to start experimenting, for instance, with a new element that you might want to bring into the web spec system, a good place to start with is his sarcasm element. It's a fake new element. Well, it's an idea for a new element in HTML to mark up sarcasm, and it adds like sarcastic marks around the element, and it's also a very simple element. So if you have an idea for an element that you want to build, it's a good place to start from there. Once we've done pushing this out, and I would say the site is between alpha and beta, and we're getting pretty close to being happy with it. There's a next thing that will come afterwards, which we call chapters, and this is basically the idea is to have a grassroots organizations in every city where people meet to talk about standards and what they want to do in standards. And it doesn't have to replace, I know a lot of cities have like HTML5 meetups and things like that. It's not meant to replace those. It can actually happen as part of the same thing. But the idea is really to have this network of grassroots meetups where people talk about standards, how to make them, how to improve them, etc., etc. So later this year, I'm going to start a Paris chapter. If someone wants to start a Tokyo chapter, that's wonderful. There's going to be one in Amsterdam. There's already one, I forget where, on the East Coast in the US. So this is something that's likely going to pick up speed in the next few months. It's basically Brian Cardell is running this, but it's meant to be like a really grassroots organization. So yeah, come join us. We have very nice cookies, and it's fun. So if you have any questions, happy to take them now or afterwards in the corridor. Thank you very much.
ロビンさんありがとうございました。もし何か、質問ございましたら、ちなみにダニエルさん。はい。
Thank you very much, Robin. Very interesting. So the audience here is Japanese, and the specification that you showed, which is going to be moving to webplatform.org, I think?
Yes, that's correct.
Is in English?
Yes.
So for Japanese people wanting to participate, should they try their best to write in English? Is it okay to contribute in Japanese? Or should they discuss separately in a Japanese community group or the developer group and then send a representative comment to there? Or someplace completely different?
I would think people should use whatever they feel works best for them. I speak fluently English, so I'm not the best person to answer to figure out what the best structure is for contributions. I'm certainly not opposed to people starting threads in Japanese on discourse. It seems fairly easy to filter to me if you don't understand it.
So there's no plans for a Japanese section, I guess, or a different nationality.
If it makes sense to add a Japanese section, I'm happy to add a Japanese section. Basically, you're on the platform, right? I can make you a moderator. You can, you can basically. So the way it works is you can create categories that can have subcategories. So if you want to have a Japanese category, and under that have like APIs, JavaScript, HTML, whatever, and the rule of the Japanese category is like all the discussion happens in Japanese, that's perfectly fine by me. I think it makes sense. Yeah, I know it's difficult. I mean, I live in France, so I see that people, French-speaking people, also have problems contributing sometimes, being comfortable in a technical discussion in English. And I mean, people are certainly welcome to create like language-specific subsections. Of course, then you will need at some point to surface the issues in English. Because browser vendors and standards organizations tend to work in English, but I'm sure we can work something out. If you want to start a Japanese section, go ahead, and if there are issues, we'll solve them. If it works, wonderful.
Okay, the first step would be write something in Japanese, and it's okay. They won't get kicked off.
No. We don't kick off people unless you're rude or mean. So of course the thing is, I mean, this also means that you will need. So in that case, I'll make you an admin, and you will need to find moderators for the Japanese part. Yes, you've just signed up for more work. That's what you get for asking questions. But it's not a lot of work. But because I can't moderate the Japanese section, obviously, I mean, I could randomly say, no, this is a wrong comment, but it probably would feel like not very nice. But yeah, if you can have, moderation is almost zero work. It's not, you don't have to approve things. It's, if there's a problem, report it, then you have to act on it.
Okay, but we also need to make sure that we don't duplicate effort, because we also have existing discussion forums for Japanese developers.
So I'm open to it. I mean, you know, if whatever the local community is happy with, I'm happy to support.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Yeah, there's one over there.
Yeah. Thank you so impressed speech. I was so impressed. And my question is that if discussion places to discuss about specs are very sorry. 日本語でいいですか？もし、スペックをディスカッションする場所が、とても増えた場合に、そして、ブラウザーベンダーが、任意の場所からスペックを実装することにした場合に、我々ディベロッパーは、もしスペックのアイディアがあってもどこで議論していいか見つけることができなくなるかもしれないという心配をしました。それに関して今はなんか、プレゼントする手段などは提供されているか、あるいは考えられているか、ディスカッションされているかということを、心配していますが、どうなんでしょうかということと、あともう一つ別に、今のお話、もし日本語に関してモデレートしてくださるんだったら、日本人でスペックに興味がある人は多分、英語分からなくてスペックに興味ある人は英語が分かりたいと思っていると思うので、英語で、コントリビュートするためにはどういうステップを踏むと、簡単に英語が話せるかという、モデレートをしてくださるとすごく嬉しい人が多いと思います。ちょっと別件ですいません。2つお話ししましてよろしくお願いします。
Who wants to translate?
Our first question is that you also informed that there is a lot of process to contribute to our specs, but he's a little bit concerned about there is a lot of process. Where the best process for contribution? Yeah, so there are some ideas or some hint about this.
So the question is basically there are lots of places to contribute, and this just adds a new one.
Yes.
Yeah. It's known as the, is it the 927 problem? So I presume a lot of people read XKCD. I don't know. There's this great XKCD cartoon. Actually, I think it's, no, I probably won't be able to load it. There's this great XKCD cartoon where the guy goes, there are 15 standards for light bulbs. That's stupid. Let's make a new one. And then after that, it's like we now have 16 standards for light bulbs. Yes, so it is a cause of concern, and it was one of the first feedbacks we got, is that you're just creating a new place for discussion instead of solving instead of unifying all the others. The hope is that the structure of this new place makes it easier to actually gather everyone around the same table because of the way in which it functions. It's true that we have 1,098 public mailing lists. This means there are now 1,099 forums for discussion. But at the same time, we've already seen success in that most of the contributors in the discourse system are actually people who never wrote to a mailing list. And so it's gathering a new community, and it's gathering that community around a single point where basically you don't have to worry about the mailing lists to go to. And in several cases, it's happened that a discussion has reached a point where people agreed on discourse, and someone said, hey, we should take this to the working group over here. But since it was someone who knew how the system worked, they said, you should post that to this specific mailing list. So it gives an archive of discussion that can then be fed into one of the existing places and help make progress based on that. So yes, it's a new place, but I think it really helps structure and bring the community together around basically a single watering hole. It's like the contact point for a lot of people. And so I think it does help unify the system. Does that address your concern? Or?
I'm not good at English, so I can't realize you. So I'm waiting for translation.
Sorry.
ディスコードで投げると、より良いところ、ここがいいよとかって教えてくれるんで、まずそこをスターティングポイントで、シングルポイントイシューでここっていう絞った形で議論をしてるから、そういう形でディスコードをうまく活用してほしい的なことが、はい。
ノンネイティブスピーカー少し質問を。
ノンネイティブ。
2番目のパート。
2番目のパート。2番目のパート。
What about non-native English speakers contributing to the English section of the forum?
Yeah. And he also asked that a lot of developers in Japan want to contribute to the standardization process, but there is a Japanese language barriers. So, what is the recommendation to learn or achieve to have English skills for the standardization? What is the best steps or practices?
Well, obviously the best steps is to speak English, but that's not very helpful to people. I think what Daniel was proposing earlier about having language-specific sections under which we can have like the same categories that we have at the top level sections makes sense. We still have to figure out a way of getting the communities to coordinate at the end of a discussion, but I think it really helps. And I suspect that French people will also want to do the same thing because I see the same problem at home. So yeah, I think we're certainly very welcoming of contributions and we want to make it as easy as possible. So in the perfect world, we'd have automated translation systems that actually work, but they're not quite there yet. So yeah, I think having language-specific sections to the site and making it possible for people to contribute in a language that they're comfortable with, and then we figure out how to coordinate the entire community makes a lot of sense to me.
ジャパニーズカントリーみたいなものを設けて、でそこの中でなんだろうな、多分ちょっと補足するとそういうコミュニケーションするところをうまく補足していってそこから慣れていくっていうやり方がいいのかなと。完全な自動翻訳の機械はワークしてないんでそういう感じかなというような回答が。
人が並んでもう無理です。はい。
すみません。
すみません。すみません。ちょっと時間がないので、個人的にお願いしていいですか。
質問ではないんですよ。
質問ではない。HTML5 ジャパニーズコミュニティグループについて言った方がいいかなと思ったんですけれども、今までHTML5 ジャパニーズインタレストグループというのがあって、私と矢倉さんとで共同で議長をしてたんですけれども、それがそれの後継として HTML5 ジャパニーズコミュニティグループ HTML5 日本コミュニティグループというのが新しくできました。そこもその HTML5 のスペックとか、HTML5 に限らず W3C の関連スペックについて、日本語で議論できる場所として考えて、そことその英語での議論とつなぐような役割をができたらなと私は考えてます。すいません。ちょっと矢倉さんちょっと英語で言ってくれればありがたいです。
So we recently relaunched the former only called Japanese HTML5 Japanese interest group into a community group, and we are welcoming a new contributor. Japanese contributors. So maybe we could discuss the issue in Japanese and the community group, and then send back to the discourse or whatever. Yeah.
I mean, honestly, from my point of view, I don't want to impose a way of working on people. I think people work best when they work in the way in which they're most comfortable. So, if the HTML5 Japanese community group feels more comfortable working, on the mailing list and then bringing things to discourse, that's perfectly perfectly fine by me. Or if people want to go directly to discourse in Japanese, that's also fine. I mean, it's not up to me to decide how people should feel would feel most comfortable. So I leave that to the HTML5 Japanese community to figure out what they feel is best. But any solution you come up with is good for me. We want contributors. We want you. It's important. Thank you very much. Thank you.